Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to be talking about 4 misconceptions and 5 tips when studying for the SAT. If you don't know who I am, I'm Keith. I'm a high school boarding student, and on this channel I like to explore ideas that allow us to live fulfilling, intentional, and productive lives. Keep in mind that I'm only a high school student, so anything that I say here works for me and may not necessarily work for you. And with that said, I hope that you can take these tips and misconceptions that I've learned from my own experience and apply them to when you have to study for the SAT yourself. The first misconception is that you need a specialized SAT tutor. I'm a big believer in self-learning, and I see the SAT as no different from that. Essentially, my thought process is that the SAT tests you on your math and your English skills, which are core subjects in any US high school or most international high schools. I don't see the need to venture outside or to try and find tutors that are outside of a regular math or English class. So drawing from this thought process of mine, it kind of makes sense that if I needed help with reading comprehension or a math concept, I would just go to my regular teacher instead of trying to find a specialized SAT tutor. And now some of you might be worried that your school teachers aren't good enough. And to that I say that later on I'll tackle some ways that you can self-learn. Also, another tip is that most tutors teach you by using practice tests. What happens is that these practice tests are usually taken from online free resources. And while that could be helpful for some people, in my eyes, it just feels like they're giving away answers that are already available on the internet with a few extra steps. Misconception number 2 is that you can study for the test the moment you realize it's too late to study for the test. When I was doing research for my SAT practice, I saw online people saying, oh, how to study for the SAT in 2 weeks, how to study for the SAT in 5 days, 2 days even. And I know some of my friends have stayed up or pulled all-nighters trying to finish an assignment that they procrastinated on. For the math test, as I mentioned before, you don't have all the information before you go into the test, whereas for the SAT, you're most likely to have 99 or 95% of the information already there before you go in. So staying up late trying to cram for that isn't going to increase your score by a significant amount and might even decrease it because you're getting less sleep. So advice for you who are maybe watching this when it's a little bit too late is to accept the situation, go to sleep and do your best. So misconception number 3 is that you can't improve your reading score. And like a lot of others, I assume that basically since reading comprehension was so abstract and there was no clear way or clear curriculum to get better at it, that automatically my reading score was fixed. I want to provide some encouragement for all of you who are feeling the same thing that I did feel, and to know that this isn't a fixed number. Your reading score can improve by quite a lot. In the end, my reading score actually ended up being a lot better than my math score, and that was because I broke down this misconception of that reading was too abstract for me to get better at, and I embraced it rather than try to focus on other things. And if you're looking for more advice on how to practice reading, I go over that more in the tip section of this video. The fourth and final misconception is that more time spent studying for the SAT means a higher score. When I first started my SAT studying journey, I thought that the answer was to keep on grinding away at SAT practice tests and just do so many that I just got an inherent feel. But the truth is that that is not the way to go. There are certain limitations to just doing practice tests, which means that the more time spent studying does not necessarily mean you'll get a higher score. For example, you're doing the entire test instead of focusing on a specific math concept that shows up a lot. For example, maybe algebra or solving simultaneous equations, or maybe you're getting a type of reading passage wrong. For me, I got a lot of history passages wrong, and at the beginning I made the mistake of just doing more and more practice tests instead of understanding why I was struggling with history texts. So to serve as a warning but also as encouragement, you will never improve your score unless you understand why you're getting the questions wrong. And that means it's essential to focus on specific types of questions or specific concepts instead of focusing on such a broad picture that you can't pinpoint any mistakes or common errors that you make. By having focused practice sessions, you're able to identify weaknesses, and so when you actually take the real test, you won't be left trying to go for your gut feeling, and instead you'll be able to understand the thought process and how to analyze the question. So now that you know some of the misconceptions that I went through, you can start applying some of the tips that I'm about to mention into your own SAT practice. Tip number 1 is to use the Khan Academy website. If there's one thing that you can take from this video, is that the Khan Academy website is going to be your lifesaver. For me, it was basically the only SAT practice program that I use, and I'm so confident about Khan Academy for a number of reasons. Number 1 is that at the very beginning they give you a diagnostic test where you basically do a practice SAT right off the bat. From there it calculates your baseline level for your math and your English. From then on it calculates specific subsections. Within math you will have algebra 2, or how to draw graphs, how to interpret data. It basically lists out all your sub strengths and your sub weaknesses from a scale of 2 to 4, 4 being the best. And from there, it tailors the practice that you do to those weaknesses. In addition to that, it also helps you form a habit. After you take the diagnostic test, it creates a schedule, a daily practice schedule for you, where you have a specific number of practice questions you're supposed to do. And also on top of that, they have 10 practice tests that are scattered throughout your daily schedule. Those serve as checkpoint markers to see how your progress is improving and what needs more work. So tip number 2 is to use schoolwork as practice for the SAT. Similar to misconception number 1, I thought that when I wanted to get a better score on the SAT, I would have to specifically focus on practicing the SAT. So to save time and also kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So if I have one chapter of English reading to do, instead of skimming it over like I usually would, I would focus intently on trying to practice my reading comprehension, understanding the main idea, the dialogue, and just thinking about it, getting my brain in that kind of SAT mindset is already greatly helpful when you're actually taking the test. A recommendation I have is that you take the weaknesses that Khan Academy identifies for you in the reading section, and you apply that to the books that you are reading in class. So tip number 3 is to read outside of school. It's a similar theme to the previous tip, where you want to be utilizing your time outside of practicing for the SAT as much as possible. And what better way to do that than to read? At first, if you're not used to reading outside of school, you might start off with things that you really like. If you're already comfortable with reading, looking at your Khan Academy stats and seeing what type of reading material you get wrong the most, and reading that kind of material will help you tenfold. For example, you're developing your innate ability to analyze and comprehend social science texts, so that when it comes to the SAT, you're able to do it naturally, instead of having to practice on really short social science SAT passages. Tip number 4 is to talk to yourself while answering SAT questions. Oftentimes, I found myself switching on autopilot mode whenever I have to concentrate for a long time. There's obviously silly mistakes when you get the test back and you realize, oh my gosh, I made such a stupid mistake. 1 plus 1 does not equal 3. When you're concentrating on the SAT, you can be prone to a lot of silly mistakes. One method that I found that really helps is to talk to myself while answering the question. If I'm doing a reading question, for example, I'll read the question aloud to myself, then I'll skim through the answers, select one that I think is the right answer, say it out loud, and go back into the text to look for the piece of evidence. And this is the most important part. I will explain aloud the connection between that piece of evidence and the answer that I've chosen. Especially in reading, the SAT can play tricks on your mind to make you think that this is the right answer when it really is something else. So clearly articulating your ideas helps you switch off autopilot and to focus on getting the right answer. The fifth and final tip is to change your mindset about the SAT in general. Especially since the last year has been stressful enough for all of us, I decided to try and change my perspective of the SAT from a negative one to a positive one. Most of the time, you hear a lot of people complain about how they stayed up so late, spent so many hours studying for the SAT, and they still didn't get the score that they want. That can really have an effect on people who are going to take the test. And I decided that I had enough with the stress and that I would just try to focus on myself. I ended up turning the SAT into kind of a game for myself. I'd say I would aim for a full score even though I knew it was very unlikely. And also, I try to finish each section as fast as possible without sacrificing any quality. So in my mind, I basically turned the SAT from a serious test into a game. And when you're able to do that, when you're able to trick your mind into making you think that whatever you're doing is a game, you start trusting yourself a lot more. You start feeling less stressed. And as a result, you're able to answer questions more freely without worrying about the final end result. So when we were in the test room, I told my friend this. I told him I'm actually so excited to get started. I can't wait to finish all the sections as fast as possible. And he seemed a little bit skeptical, but I saw a lot of people who were stressed out, who were scared they weren't gonna get a good score. And I was just excited to be there, excited to try to finish and beat my high score as fast as possible. I kind of thought of it as Pac-Man, where you're just trying to get faster, more efficient so that you can level up. So in all seriousness, not only did that mindset shift help me feel less stressed, but I also actually enjoyed myself because of it. So that's the end of this SAT video. I hope that you've learned something from this video that you can apply to your own SAT study program. If you found this video helpful in any way, please consider subscribing or liking, and I'll see you guys soon.